Michaela, you've had periods in your life as a family where your dad has probably feared he may lose you. You feared you may lose your dad, and you both may have feared that you would lose your mum, Michaela, and Jordan, your wife. I mean, you've had some extraordinary things to deal with as a family. How have you dealt with that?
We communicated.
Jeez, we communicated a lot. Yeah. And prayed at the end when it got really tough.
So that's interesting.
We tried to find our way through. I told Michaela when she was a little kid, I told her at one point when she got really sick, I said, we had a very serious conversation. She wasn't a very old girl. I said, look, kid, you're going to have a very hard life. It's going to be brutal. And this is after we knew she had the worst case of arthritis that the Toronto Sick Kids hospital had ever seen. That's not a diagnosis you want to hear from a hospital, not a big hospital. Like, your child has the worst case of this illness we've ever seen. It's like, what's her prognosis? Multiple early joint replacements. So that's like painful degeneration followed by early death. Oh yeah, that's not so good. Well, so what's worse than that? Well, what's worse than that is adopting the role of victim, becoming resentful, and turning against life, because then you get to have multiple early collapsed joints followed by death, and you get to be ultimately miserable and in hell at the same time. So I sat her down and I said, look, kid, don't ever use your illness as an excuse. Like, it's going to be difficult for you to do things, difficult for you to get up in the morning to go to school. It's going to be painful. And it's even going to be hard for you to tell when you can do something and when you can't, when you're justified in saying, look, Dad, I just can't get out of bed. I said, don't fool yourself about your illness, because then you won't be able to distinguish what you can do from what you can't do, and then you will truly be lost. And she listened. You know, I don't think you were more than about 9 or 10 when we had that conversation. She listened. Yeah. I had a conversation with my son at about the same time. You know, and I said, look, kid, your sister is very sick and we're screwed. And the probability that I'm going to be able to pay sufficient attention to you for the next few years is like 0. You're going to have to, like, face this, and you're going to have to grow up and take this on yourself. And you cannot be any trouble, because we've got enough trouble. Any more, it's going to sink us. And so he listened, and he was no trouble. I mean, how was Julian with you when you were at home?
Good. Very good. Compassionate for somebody who's fairly disagreeable.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he stuck around. He was at home. I mean, he had lots of friends, and he did his teenage things, but he came home and he helped, and he was no trouble.
We have a clip,
he had his things to deal with, but he took care of them himself.
We have a clip of you guys with Julian, I think, just several years ago, which will show people, just to show who Julian is.
And so one of the great ways to figure out what to write about is, well, what bugs you? Notice that. That's that involuntary rumination. That's the manifestation of underlying complexes from a psychoanalytic perspective. So something's on your mind, poking you, bugging you. It's like Jiminy Cricket in Pinocchio.
That is really annoying.
That's why I did it, man. I knew that would bug you.
It's a great clip. We don't see a lot of Julian. You know, he's not as high profile as you two. But you're a very tight family. I mean, Michaela, the way your dad talked that, it could be taken as being tough love, or it could be just a reality check of, look, you can either spend the next few years of your life feeling sorry for yourself, or you can crack on with life and make the best of it, which is exactly the advice I would have given one of my children in that position. But how did you feel at the time you were given it?
Well, I think I remember that, and I think I was in grade 2. So I would have been 7 or 8. I was pretty little. So I didn't even, like, at that time, I didn't even understand what arthritis was. I thought, oh, great, I have an old person disease. That's as much as I understood, and I didn't want to tell anybody about it because it was an old person disease. And so I don't even think I had second thoughts about anything Dad said because I was so young. I just figured, okay, that's my dad, that's what he says I should do, then I'll do it. I don't think I thought anything more than that. But I do think that was instrumental in getting out of chronic illness, honestly.
Yeah, because you barely got out of it. If you would have complicated it up with some additional stupidity, some resentment, well, I think that's probably true in our family in general. I mean, we didn't do things perfectly, but we did our best not to be resentful, and resentment is really a killer. I think if you would have burdened yourself with victimized resentment, you wouldn't have made it.
Yeah, you know what I did rather than become resentful? And I don't know if this was a healthy thing to do, but I got really angry. I didn't get angry at anybody per se. I got angry in a, it wasn't feeling sorry for myself, but it was, what am I gonna do to get out of this?
That's
like, how
resolution,
dare
man.
life do this to me? That's not who I am.
Yep.
So I was angry for a long time.
Yeah, well,
Jordan,
that's part of, one of the things you want to do is you want to get your anger on your side. You want to put it inside instead of facing you and stopping you. You want to use it as a force that drives you forward. And you definitely did that. You were a pretty implacable person.
You know, it's interesting listening to you both talking about that, because I had a fascinating conversation a few years ago with Joe Biden, who had just lost his son Beau to brain cancer. And obviously he'd also, many years before, lost his wife and baby daughter in a car crash. And his two sons survived and were badly hurt and so on. And everyone knows the story, but I'd written a newspaper column about Beau Biden after he died, because he used to come on my old show at CNN. And I just said, look, this guy was an amazing guy. He'd been a state's attorney general. He'd been an Iraq war hero. He had a lovely family. He was going right to the top, I felt, politically. He may even have become president candidate, perhaps. And I said, he'll now be the best president America will never know they could have had. And I wrote this column, heartfelt. I liked him very much. I thought he was very impressive. And Joe Biden called me. He was vice president at the time. And I'd never met him. And he had a 15, 20-minute conversation with me. And I asked him, I said, I've got 4 children. I don't know how you would ever deal with losing a child. You've had to do this twice, and you lost your first wife. How do you deal with it? And he said, it's interesting. He said, as I talk to you, I have in front of me a cartoon strip, Hagar the Horrible. And it was in 2 parts. And in one part, Hagar was on a boat that was floundering on the rocks. And he had his trident, and he was raising it to the skies in very stormy conditions and shouting at the gods, why me? And in the second part of the cartoon, the gods shout back, why not? And he said he got annoyed originally when he saw that. When his dad had found it in a flea market. He got annoyed. He thought it was insensitive. And then the more he thought about it, the more he realized what his dad was saying, which is you cannot rationalize what's happened to you. You can't try and work out why it's happened to you. Stuff happens like this to people all the time. In a way, it's different, but the way that you talk to Michaela about her condition, it's kind of similar. Is that you didn't waste time and energy trying to rationalize this or explain why you'd been singled out. It was just a case of it's happened, we've got to deal with it.
Well, I went to Jerusalem with a friend of mine, Jonathan Pageau, and Pageau's a very brilliant man. And we walked the Via Dolorosa, which is the route of Christ's Passion with its 12 stations. And each station is a kind of, is a microcosm of suffering. And then, of course, the entire journey culminates in the most unjust suffering imaginable. And that's what the story is. The Christian Passion is the story of the most unjust suffering imaginable. And you might say, well, what does that have to do with you? And the answer is, that's going to happen to you. There's going to be unjust suffering in your life. And you're called upon to radically embrace that and to say yes. And that's even the case if it's your children who are called upon to make the sacrifice. And that's the story of Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac. God calls on Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. And, that seems like a bit much, but you have to offer your children to the world. You have to offer your children to be destroyed by the world. You have to say yes to that radically, full-heartedly. And the more you do that, weirdly, paradoxically, the more you do both of those, accept that for yourself, accept that for your children, welcome it, the less catastrophic this sacrifice has to be. It's so paradoxical. Well, you think about it, if you protect your children unduly, you weaken them. If you let them encounter the world and the micro tragedies that go along with that encounter, let's say, they get strong.
Yeah.
And there's no limit to that. There's no upper end. And so that's why in the Judeo-Christian tradition, for example, you're enjoined to take up your cross and bear it and to walk uphill nonetheless. And the reason for that is there is no better alternative. Of course, you have to say yes to life. And that means saying yes to some pretty brutal realities.